believe we are live, so I will begin with the word of prayer. Gracious and kind God, we are grateful for this opportunity to bring these amazing minds together to have conversation that prayerfully, Lord, that you would help us learn how to make practical. We're grateful for the opportunity of servitude and servicing not only you, but servicing your people. We pray, oh God, that you would enlighten us, envision us, and give us the passion and the renewed strength to continue to work on your behalf. God, never allow us to take the glory nor the credit. All glory belongs to you because, God, you are the one that imparted us with the gift to be able to do what we do. Bless now this conversation for your glory. In your name we pray. Amen.
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 So good evening and welcome to Courageous Conversation. With the upcoming election, it is important for us to understand, or should I say kind of revisit the role of the Black church and Black pastors in the process of advocacy and as education or educators. Specifically when it comes to the role within the context of the Black community. So this evening with us, we have some great scholars of the word and pastors who are actively engaged within their churches and also within their communities. And I'm kind of excited about this conversation specifically because it is kind of a lead into the election process, but also it's a follow-up to my dissertation. And my dissertation was on the Black church as a mediating structure. How the voice of the community was relayed through pastors to political leaders for policy change. And so a little different than our natural or our usual process is I'm going to take a few minutes and just kind of share with you all, the listening audience, to understand when we say mediating structure, what it means as a mediating structure and how the Black church identifies as this mediating structure. So I'm going to share my screen with you so that you all can see a brief PowerPoint. And interestingly, it's funny when you pull out research that you did years ago and how it's still valid for today's conversation, especially when we see what's happening within our community. And so a mediating structure is defined as those structures standing between the individual in his private life and the large structure of public life. Thereby, the mediating structure empowers individuals in a diverse society, and then it also provides venues for civic discourse. And so mediating structures are those things that are classified within our neighborhood, our family, church, and voluntary associations. They also provide a voice for the community by transmitting values of the community to the institutions of public life. They have a fundamental role in shaping policy through the dialogue between community organizations and policymakers. So through civic participation, they are the agents. So in other words, the Black church is the agent that empowers social groups for reasons of wealth, gender, religion, race. But these agents cannot empower themselves specifically through the electoral process without this mediating structure. And so then they advocate for the needs of the community. Mediating structure, what does it mean when it's advocacy involved? It's representation, citizen participation, political accountability, network building, coalition, legal and legislative advocacy, grassroots advocacy, and media advocacy. And tonight you will get to hear from some of our pastors that are on the panel who actually engage in these means of advocacy within their churches and within the structures of their community. And so their churches are operating this idea of this mediating structure. And faith-based nonprofits, religious organizations are that of mediating structures. And so the Black church in which we are a part of, everyone on this panel is a part of the Black church as defined historically. And so the Black church serves as that cornerstone. It's been the cornerstone to community since the institution of slavery. It provides social services, innovators of freedom movements, advocates for the community in social and injustice issues. And so when we think about the Black church, we think about the different roles of our pastors through clergy influence, organizational partnerships, and civic empowerment. And so to begin our discussion, I would like to ask our panelists first to introduce yourselves, and then I have a question to go along with that introduction. And in your introduction, provide your name, your church name. And then I want you to think about and answer what comes to mind when you think about the Black church. And let's begin with Pastor Punch.
I knew that. Good evening, everyone. My name is L. David Punch. I pastor the historic Greater Zion Missionary Baptist Church in Houston's Third Ward community. What do I think of what comes to mind when I think of the Black church? For me, I think of family. I think of the church being the light of the world. And also I think of the church being the community of faith and a part of the community that helps create that environment of a common unity in whatever that community might be. So I think that kind of sums up what I think our role is.
Okay. Let's have Pastor Cash.
Okay, so Reverend Cash, the pastor of East Mount Zion Baptist Church. And Black church is a little, for me, it's multifaceted, it's multidimensional. And I think you can't look at Black church without looking at it from the whole spectrum, from its emergence out of what 𝐓𝐈𝐓𝐃𝐄𝐒 would call the hush harbors and that space in slavery. And so Black church for that era was a sense of relief. And then it merges into a center for community. The boys would argue that no one else could, black people can go nowhere else but Black church. And then, so it's center of community. And then in the 60s, become a center of prophetic voice. And then you move into a center of religious worship. So big worship centers emerge. So it's just so multifaceted. I don't think it's one word to identify Black church. I just think it represents who Black people are. They are multidimensional. You can't box them in. But they are just multifaceted. So
we'll move on to Reverend Fields.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm Leslie Houseworth Fields. I'm the pastor of the Mark Montclair, St. Mark's United Methodist Church in Montclair, New Jersey. When I think of the Black church, I think about what Pastor Cash talked about the hush harbors in slavery. And one of the things that our ancestors were doing in those hush harbors, in addition to worshiping God, was asserting their full humanity. They were gathering in a space, in a society that had deemed them less than fully human, only 3/5 of a human being. And so they were saying that despite the religion that you've given us that has tried to convince us that we don't matter, we recognize that we matter to God and that we matter to each other. And over the years, the Black church, although not a monolith, I think the Black church has primarily tried to help Black folks connect with God, connect with one another, and connect with the world.
I couldn't agree with you more. And you can believe that I'm coming back to some of the language that we've used or that you all have used in these thoughts around the Black church. But before I do that, I want to go to Reverend Howard and have you to introduce yourself.
Emery's in the building, by the way. Reverend Fields, thank you very much for that.
Right, Reverend Cash, I forgot, there are 3 Emery. That was not intentional, audience.
Oh, that's right, Cash too. You got to bring him in too. Well, good evening. Thank you for having me, Dr. Burden. My name is Reverend Eric Howard, and I am the pastor of the Mount Olive Missionary Baptist Church here in Canton, Ohio. When I think about the Black church, I just kind of right away think of it as premier institution in the Black community, and that it has served, like your PowerPoint said, Dr. Burden, as the cornerstone of the community, or the backbone of the Black community, spiritually, psychologically, socially, politically, and in so many other ways as well. I also think of it as the primary medium through which we've been able to more fully express ourselves, and where we can shout and pray our troubles away, while also being the headquarters where we can get politically motivated and organize social justice campaigns that we might tend to those who are less fortunate in clothing those who are naked and feeding those who are hungry, and so on and so forth. You talk about healthcare, job opportunities, gainful employment, educational programs, you name it. The Black church has at one point or another been the custodial host and conduit through which all of these kinds of programs have existed and helped us to feel, like Reverend Fields said, affirmed. You understand? It's a safe haven as well, where we're able to convene and fellowship. We can laugh together. We can cry together. We are revived and replenished together, where we plan and strategize to exercise our voice, that justice might be fully had by all of us. So, like Dr. Cash said, it's kind of all of these different things, a very multifaceted and necessary entity in our communities, historically and presently.
And Reverend Howard was worried that he didn't have anything to say. But in that, and in thinking about, and that's what I'm really excited about, is just the level of not only, as I say, biblical scholarship that you all possess, but also the level of academic scholarship and community awareness and relationship. And so when we begin to think about the Black community and how the Black church fits into the Black community as that cornerstone, as that center of the community, as that nucleus, how do you think the Black church's role has changed historically from where it was to where it is now? Or has there been a change?
Like I said, it is.
And I'll pose that to anyone that would like to answer.
I couldn't see in the dark.
I'll jump in here. One of the changes I think we've seen is that there was a time where I think the Black church was the center of life in the Black community. And while the Black church still remains a center, I don't know if it's the center, right? And one of the things that one of the ways that some churches are struggling is that we have not figured out that instead of bringing the table, we can take a seat at the table, and even if we aren't the ones bringing the table or hosting the party, that does not mean that our work is any less valuable. And so, no, people are not necessarily looking to the Black church as the source of all information, but we still have a very important role we can play in bringing people together.
Yeah, I think that the evolution of the Black church, it helped in terms of how we were able to respond and adapt to certain pieces, but it also hurt us moving from, and this is what I argue, moving from hush harbors and brush harbors, moving from the civil rights movement into American individualism, in terms of the American dream, right? So once we move from oppression, or as my grandfather would call the Mason-Dixon line, and we started to emerge and assimilate into what we call individualism, churches that were once community-based became filled with commuters in church, right? So everybody in the church was centered around building their own income and building their own families. And so you got access to move to this neighborhood and move to that neighborhood. And so the church did not become the church that used to be community-based or community church became a church filled with people who lived on the other side of town. And that progressed for 20 or 30 years, and you get to a church like our church personally, where our church has more members that live out of the community than live in the community. And it can be very disconnecting, especially when you become disconnected from the community that you exist in. And so I think those evolutions have happened. And also, when you talk about ministry and connecting to community, when we talk about center of the community, it's kind of difficult to be center of the community when the community has more opportunities and more accessibilities. It used to be the point where you can come to the church and I only could vote at church, I only could get a job at church, I only could do this at church. Now your kids are involved in sports, they're involved in curricular activities, extracurricular activities, where at one time church was all we could go or all we knew. Now church is an additional component of my weekly schedule and no more the center of my weekly schedule. We used to spend we used to spend all day in church, from Sunday all throughout the week. Now, do we have to go? Because I still got to go to all these other things. So I think two things happened. One thing happened is the church emerged into this kind of individualistic piece. And so the people became individualistic minded and disconnected from community. And then the people in the community understood that I have other options. And you're not offering me what these other organizations are offering me. You are 20 years behind, while this CDC down the street is offering me what I need.
Interesting thoughts behind that, and I'm going to touch on that. Did anyone else want to add anything to the previous question before I
agree with what's been stated already, but I do still believe that the Black church is the primary vessel through which the prophetic voice of the pastor will be heard. And that voice will always be a powerful and distinctive voice, because when God said, I give you pastors according to mine heart, that's when we became a distinctive voice in the community, a voice that is always crying out in the wilderness and pointing to the hope and the help that we have in Jesus Christ. And so while these changes are always occurring and calling for us as the Black church to reimagine who we are and who we may need to be in these very trying and challenging times, I think that we still have a very rich imprint in history, a foundation in history that still allows us to have a very effective and meaningful role in our society today.
Now how is that as practical or theoretical now?
I'm going to call that very much practical.
Okay.
Absolutely, has to be practical, because we have a calling to fulfill, even if we are doing it amongst the remnant.
Right.
Even if we don't have church the way we have it, it's not as populated as it was, not as highly regarded as it once was. We still have to be about, as it were, our Father's business, and trying to model, come on in here, man, and exemplify the virtues of heaven, man. Come on.
Let me chime in, and I echo what has been said. When we talk about Black church and its role at one point to be the center of the community, I think all of us can speak to the fact that gentrification has changed a number of our neighborhoods, so that the communities in which our churches were established, those communities no longer look the same. And as you said, Pastor Cash, people have moved out, and it's no longer the center of the hub. And what we're left with, many of us, especially if we're historic churches, we're left in communities that are filled with the last, the least, and the lost. So our role then shifts in that community, where we become more ministry minded, because most of the people now in the community, they have needs, whether they be food needs, whether they need housing assistance needs. And so the Black church has an opportunity to shift and be the catalyst for other important activities in the Black community, not just for those who are left. One of the things that we've discovered here, especially in the community in which I pastor, we probably have 30 churches that are over 100 years old. And if those individual churches are going to survive, it's because they have ministries tied to what they do. No longer can the church just be the place where we come and worship. It needs to be a place where, and I'm glad we're having this discussion regarding political awareness and being involved, where the church has to actually be a vanguard and a rear guard to that community. And because community development and community changes is cyclical, the church has to weather those kind of storms so that we can be positioned where, when those changes happen, the church can address those particular needs. So we still have a prophetic voice. Yes, Reverend Howard, we still have that voice. But I think when and someone said, it might have been you, Reverend Howard, when Jesus says, to the disciples, when I was hungry, you didn't feed me. When I was naked, you didn't clothe me. All of those things, we were educated. The pastor used to be the most educated person in the church. That's not the case anymore. And so, and some of us don't realize that. We still operate with that. And so we try to do, outside of what our scope is. But I think, the Black church still has it's still important, but we got to figure out how we magnify that importance, in the changing dynamics of those various communities and the hearts of people.
And in that, I've got there are a couple of questions that have arisen that I'm thinking about, but I want to go back and then I want to move into the church's role in political awareness and advocacy and education. But I want to go back to this idea of historically, we know that the Black church was developed because when we look at mainstream America, we were not allowed as Blacks to be a part of mainstream. The country was not developed for us. In no entity. And so, when you look at the founding fathers and what the founding fathers constituted within the Constitution, it was not written for Black people. Black people were not human. Black people were chattel slaves historically. And so in that, when we begin to think about philosophical thought, and we think around the concepts of integration and desegregation, and I think about how integration affected the Black church and began to change the model and the mode of the Black church. And because Pastor Cash, you said this, we ended up now through this process of integration finding our spaces, or attempting and still attempting to find our space within American society. And so with that, how do you think integration impacted the Black church?
All right. I think if we think about the way integration impacted our communities as a whole, I heard somebody say, I can't remember where I saw this now, is that many times, because some of our communities have struggled so, we tell our best and our brightest to leave the community, right? People are well intentioned. When you get your degree, don't come back here. There's nothing here for you, right? And in some ways, we've embraced this idea that our churches, our schools, our Black colleges, these different institutions were good enough for us when that was all we had. But once we're able to access something else, then we should go for those. I think there has always been a remnant of people who have not bought into that. But I think now is this return. We even see right now this exodus of Black people from white churches coming back to Black churches because they're realizing, the predominantly white church was not better. And in some ways, it's been worse because I am not valued there, right? But there has been this idea when we were forced to be separate, some of us believe that we were inferior, when it's not that we as a people were inferior. It was that we, much like today, were not funded adequately, right? But there's something about this desire for something that somebody tells you can't have, and I think there was this move for people to be able to explore other churches in this time of integration. We're now realizing that was not necessarily the best thing for us. That doesn't mean that we can only worship with Black people, but that there is something valuable about being in a space that prioritizes our needs, that prioritizes our experiences, and that is reminding us that we have inherent value, not because of what we can do or produce, but simply because of who we are.
Who we are, yes, and who we were created to be. If we were recognized for what we have actually contributed to this country and worldwide, from Genesis to Revelation, then the world would be a much better place. But that's just a sidebar. Anyone else want to answer that? If not, I will move on and switch gears a little bit.
Well, I think that it not only it enticed Black people to emerge into the sense of multiculturalism and engage into the sense of being in a space with other white folk or other cultures, but also I think it gave breed to this need for prosperity gospel, right? So American capitalism is the sense of individualism. So I need to gain wealth for myself and my family, and I move beyond the hood to gain all of these various different things. But then the church tapped into this, and then mega churches emerged, and then they kind of fed on that desire for people to have mass wealth, where the gospel, in terms of, especially in terms of Black heritage and Black community, was never about individualism, but was all about community. It was all about building Black community. It was all about building your neighbor. Gospel is all about building one's neighbor. Love God, love neighbor as self, right? Go ye therefore to all the world to bring people into community. But this emergence into, as you use the word integration, integrating into American society gave the church license to search into individualism and individual wealth and individual productivity that then created, I believe, what we see now as prosperity gospel, and suggests that everybody can have wealth and everybody can have this and everybody can have that, which actually made the church prosper in terms of individualistic churches, where we now model American capitalism, where you have large churches that have $1 million budgets, while you have more poor churches and more disenfranchised churches that don't even have a $20,000 budget, right? So the Black church modeled what we saw in this moment of integration, when they fed off of the desire for Black people to have more, right? So to come from poverty and come from a disenfranchisement, and so you fed off of that and created the mega church, because mega churches are filled with who? Poor Black people, right? And then poor Black people go to multicultural churches and sense something that I don't have before, when the creation of the Black church was supposed to be communal. And it's supposed to be community in the sense of building a group of people up. So we bit the bug, and now we're searching for bigger churches and bigger buildings, because that's what we saw, the part of the American dream. When everyone does not eat, only some eats, and most everybody else starves and is poor. And we create ministries that make us feel good about what we've done in terms of growth, because we're feeding this group and we're paying for gas over here, we're doing all this kind of make us feel good, but we have strayed away from what the essence of what it means to be the Black church. So integration, I think, as King would argue before he dies in 1968, but in 67 he says, well, integration really, the dream was became a nightmare because we ran into a burning building. Right, and that system affected the church, I think, as well, where the ministry that Punch you talked about was supposed to help people. The help is something that helps us grow, while we're only feeding people, but they're still starving.
Yeah. Reverend Fields, you started us off with this notion of integration and how it's affected the Black church. And I just want to throw this out. I mean, is the Black church really, is integration, are we victims of integration? Are we victims, of traditionalism that forced us to remain something that was not adaptive to, you said what others were looking for, whether they were going, to the white church or to the mainstream church. I mean, I think sometimes, I don't think integration caused them to leave us, even though they moved out. I mean, because Black church can still move out. But I think, we have a hard time maintaining them to stay, rather, because traditionalism, and you know, it's a struggle for the young people to say, well, how do I see where the church is going to meet my needs when they're still stuck in, you know, these traditional things, and how does it meet my need? I'm going to go to where I think they're going to be meeting my needs and addressing those issues. So I just thought I'd throw that out because, I mean, you know, we talk about integration, but, you know, it's true. But then there's some things internally that we did not adapt to that again, we're still 20, 30 years behind. You know. So.
I think it's an interesting question, and Pastor Fields did get us started off with a very interesting response, intriguing response. But one of the things I think also has happened, even though I believe that many of our churches are still very much not integrated, but as our community has tried to assimilate and integrate through the years, Pastor Fields, when you talk about Black people returning to the Black church from white churches, I think one of the consequences or the results of us trying to integrate is that Black churches became better able to see their Blackness in Scripture, in the words, in the pages of the Holy Writ. It's not as common today as it once was in our desire to assimilate, to go into a Black church and see a picture of a white Jesus hanging somewhere. Or the Last Supper being all white folks sitting at the table. And so the backlash when we realized that we are not as affirmed as we had hoped to be when we are in these so-called integrated sacred spaces, we have now realized that we are Black, we are beautiful, and so says the Scriptures, if you understand interpreting the Scriptures in that way.
Yeah, definitely. And I think about Reverend Cass, you quoted Martin Luther King, but I think about when Malcolm X said that that when you use the analogy of Black coffee, and that when you have Black coffee Black coffee is strong, but when you add cream, when you integrate cream within that Black coffee, it becomes weaker. And so very often I think about that as we talk about the Black church and the role of integration. Many have spoke of integration being the worst thing that happened to the Black community. Others look at it in different viewpoints, but as our role within society, specifically within the Black church, we're still navigating these systems, and these systems that, as I said earlier, were not created for us to be a part of. But I think it was Pastor Punch who took us into tradition and the concept and ideas behind tradition. And so when we think about tradition, traditionally, the Black church was that place where if a candidate or an issue needed to be voiced, it was done in the Black church on Sunday morning, because that's where you had the Black community. That's where you had the large amount of Blacks that were a part of the congregation. And so in that, what role do you think the Black church should play in political awareness?
Well, I think the Black church is still that place, right? Even if there are not as many people there, and even if we are not the center of Black life in a community, it is still an important place. And I think now in the election year, not this year because like my church is still worshiping remote, perhaps some of yours are as well, but 2 years ago, people were calling, can we come? May I speak? May I address your congregation? May I have a talk back after worship? Because people understand that you must, if you want to connect with Black people, you must connect with people in the Black church. Not that that's the only place, but it's an important place. And I think we must be engaged in the political process. Some people will argue, that church is not political. I would say church is not partisan, but what is of the people, the body politic, is Jesus is saying, feed the hungry. That is political, right? Jesus is saying, I was in prison and you visited me. How we treat prisoners, that is political. It's a part of our faith. It also affects our politics. It affects what policies we support, how we are advocating. So we have to be engaged politically. Just that down home, I'm Southern, right? Like, you can't be so heavenly minded that you're no earthly good.
Jesus himself was, he did not speak against politics and being involved. In fact, he said, render unto Caesar that which is Caesar. You know, when the disciples went fishing, how are they going to pay their taxes? They caught a fish and they were going to pay your taxes. So, I mean, the church has to still be in that realm. And again, we're still, you know, the place where our people meet, and they need to be educated politically, spiritually, financially, all of those other areas. And so, yeah, I agree. I mean, our role is still to be involved in that. I share all the time, and people come and they want to speak, and but we have a powerful platform, and that many of us who pastor churches, we will be still serving those churches when that particular person who ran for office has been elected, and when they're out, when their term is over, we're still serving. And so I think we still have some issues that, regardless of who that political candidate is for the season or for that term, you know, that are still, you know, relevant to our people. So we have to be engaged always in that process.
And I think that the Black church still has a critical role in the political awareness, because much of the suffering that Black folks deal with is a direct result of the politics that are played out on us and against us. And so, as somebody was saying, it's not just about that sweet by and by, but we have to have a faith that will get us there as well. But we also have to have a faith that enables us and empowers us to wrestle through some of these situations and circumstances that we have to face as Black folk. And I think the Black church plays a critical role in fostering and in building that faith that helps people to be able to endure and continue to press on, while we also recognize through that political awareness and an overall awareness of many things that we are victimized in many ways, but we don't rest on that victimization. It's through the Black church, I think, that many of us also become aware of our collective agency and our collective ability and our collecting calling and charge to stand up against injustice and to fight back against the oppression and all of the systemic problems that weigh us down. And so I think all of that feeds into the critical role and nature of the Black church with respect to political awareness and any other kind of awareness to that end.
And may I add that also, because so many of our Black churches are comprised primarily or largely of Black women who are also, as we see this year, driving so much of this political process, right? And that is a place where Black women are engaged and will remember who came and spoke at church. It doesn't mean that just because somebody comes through the church that we're going to support them, right? But we are paying attention. That is one of the most basic ways that you can connect with us. And so we still have that as an important place where people can interface.
And so in that, in thinking about the role of the Black church as it revolves around political awareness, thinking about the Black church with social movement. We know that the Black church was a cornerstone, the center of the civil rights movement, and that push that many of the leaders were Black pastors and Black preachers. And so in that, what do you think about the Black church being involved in social movements? We did lose someone, and I guess he will come back and join momentarily. So the Black church with social movements.
Well, I think as a whole, the Black church, I think it's very different from Black church in the 60s who were involved in social movements and the Black church into the 2000s. The key word is relevancy. So, and we talked about options and people having other options to go here and accessibility to go here. When we think about what happened with Black Lives Matter, the movement around Trayvon Martin and Michael Brown occurred, and where did they go first? They did not come to the church first, because to them, the church was not relevant. I was reading a book around Ferguson. It's called Ferguson and Faith. And it talks about how preachers showed up to the movement, and the people at the movement were telling the preachers, your job today is to be quiet and watch us do our work. So you look at how the shift has happened from 1960, when Emmett Till died, and the Montgomery bus boycott, all of that happened at church, and they organized in church, SALC organized in church, but in 2010 and 2011, and now organizations are happening where? Not in church, because the word is relevancy. What can you offer me? You're not connected to my concerns. And so we can talk about Black Lives Matter. We can talk about what they did, or who originated and who created and who they were in terms of their sexual orientation. But the reality is a group of people decided that we wanted to go there before we wanted to go here. So the Black church now stands, and many of them, and it's not all of them, but in terms of the church in general, we stand outside looking in the window of the movement as a museum and not a part of the movement.
I had an experience a few months ago. A colleague and I, who live in New Jersey, had decided that we would go to a march that the young people had put on in our community. And so we went to this march. We were there. It was very well organized. She and I talked about how this was perhaps the most organized march we had ever attended. The march was moving so fast, like the pace that people were walking was so fast that she and I ended up being the last two people, right, at the back. And we both had our clergy collars on, and we kind of laughed about how this became a metaphor of the role that the church can play. So often we have expected to see clergy in the front leading the charge. There's something to be said about, hey, we'll pull up the rear. We're here. We're not here to take over. We're just here to support. We don't have to speak. We're not looking for attention. We just want you all to know that we are here for you. And if we can be of service, even if it's just our bodies, right, putting our bodies on the line, we want you to know we're here. And we have to get more comfortable playing that role, that we are not in charge. We don't have to speak. It doesn't have to be our way. And even though we were not in charge, we can still participate and we can still show our support, because that's part of what makes us relevant, and that's part of what gives us credibility. We have lost some of our credibility. Sometimes it's because the loudest voices are the ones who show up at the White House and tell the president he's done more for Black people, and that's unfortunate. But people need to see more of us on the ground saying, no, we don't believe that, we don't agree with that, and we're here to support you however we can.
I want to ask a follow-up question too, and anyone can jump in, but specifically with Pastor Cash and Reverend Fields, is the relevancy. What has created this loss of relevancy within the Black church for social movements, for political awareness? Why has it been a loss of relevancy?
Well, go ahead, Cash.
No, I was going to say, I don't know if it was a loss of relevancy. I think in the 50s and the 60s, those who were champion and being the drum majors were, religious leaders, pastors of churches or mosques or whatever. And as Reverend Fields said, I said, now, that leadership is coming from somewhere else. And so the church still can undergird that. We don't have to be like lightning bug Christians, only happy when the light is shining on our tail. We can undergird and support. And I think the church has always had that opportunity to be that base, but we don't have to always, I think I mentioned earlier, we don't have to be the vanguard. Sometimes we're the rear guard, and that's not bad, but in the 50s and 60s, those that we were following and leading the march and leading the charge, they were, those religious leaders. I don't have a problem with someone else leading, but we can support that leadership.
Pastor Munch spoke earlier about our ministries, our missions, our outreach in the local community, and part of that is what gives us credibility. Pastor Eric Howard and I worked together at a church many years ago, and the senior pastor there, Gary Simpson, would talk about wasting time with people. And I remember when we first got there, we were like, what does that mean, right? Investing time, sharing time with people, because he would tell us that's where your authority comes from. And if you haven't spent time with us, you don't know our needs. So why would I trust you to speak for me, right? And so we have to stay connected with the people in the community. We can't just show up when it's time, to rock the mic, right?
Right.
They're like, no, you can't speak for us.
We spend too much time pastoring our churches and not pastoring the community. Like you say, wasting time with the community. We've got to be pastors of our community, not just in the pulpit when we got the mic. What else do you do? How do you engage with us, talk with us, listen to us?
So in speaking with in asking or following up with the role of the pastor, specifically Pastor Country, using that, you have to pastor not only the church, but the community. So as pastors, what do you feel your role is as it relates to political awareness, advocacy, educating the congregation and or the community?
I think on top of what's been said by Pastor Fields, Pastor Punch, with respect to that exchange right there, more and more it is incumbent upon us to make sure that we are relevant through relationship with the community and not just who's within the four walls. This time, this day and this age, versus the 50s and the 60s when people would come to the church, we are challenged, especially even in a pandemic, to try to figure out creative and new ways to ensure that we're taking church to the community, to the people, which is to, again, take the gospel, to take the love of God, and to show that it's not so much about how many people we can get into the church on our annual days, but becoming more and more involved with and moved by the needs of the community. We have to be advocate as well as educator, as well as everything else that Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois would mention in The Souls of Black Folks. You understand, besides the Negro preacher becoming one of the greatest inventions on American soil, we have to become, as Paul said, all things to all people. We've got to be politicians, we got to be lawyers, social workers, counselors, business people, so on and so forth. And again, not necessarily for the sake of the flock to which we've been assigned, but realizing that in our effort to spread the gospel, we have to be concerned with the welfare of humankind that exists all around us. And so I think that we have to be a number of things that will bring about enlightenment and awareness and hope in a generation that seems to be so lost. And I think also realizing, as Pastor Cash was saying, this new individualism that has arisen through the years too is also what undergirds people not being interested in organized and established religion, but what they want to talk about is spirituality. That's fine, we could dig that, but we still need to be able to operate beyond these walls and beyond the infrastructure of Baptist churches, Kojic churches, Methodist churches, or whatever there is that might be the case. My preaching professor told us, Thomas Long, don't preach the Bible, preach the word. And I think if you had that kind of idea around what we are called to do, you move beyond just the pages of Genesis to Revelation and realize that the gospel is larger than what's been written in the book. And even, again, to reference Dr. Simpson again, Pastor Fields, he said, don't try to apply the gospel to your life. Try to apply your life to the gospel. The gospel ought not be reduced into your little self, but rather it's larger than yourself, and you need to try to put your life, apply your life to the larger thing, which is the gospel. And I think that challenges all of the, maybe some of the traditionalism that we have grown up in our churches, that was just this neat little, cute little box and space. And we're being challenged to go beyond that today.
Well, I think the answer is in the word incarnation. So the image of incarnation is to leave divinity and become one with humanity. And I think you asked the question, what happened between the movement in 1960s and the relevancy of why we're not relevant in the movements in the 2000s is this idea of becoming one with humanity, right? So in the 60s, everybody was getting their head knocked off. Everybody was getting whooped. Everybody was getting lynched. Everybody was dealing with social issues and social ills. And so it was easy to come together. But as we move towards integration and we move towards assimilation, not everybody was on the same level. And reality is most people that were existing in churches are people that were, you call, as you keep mentioning the boys, the black bourgeoisie, right? So these individuals were the doctors, the lawyers, especially in your six-stalking churches where you had individuals who lived in these nice neighborhoods. And so that disconnect occurred. And so now that I have arrived, I've become disconnected from that community. And so the question is, how then do we become relevant? I have to now become one with them. And I never forget, a few months ago, I decided to just engage in community. And I got in the bus and got our ministry leaders and a few of our ministry leaders, and we went to the community and knocked on doors and just passing out food and to become one with the kind of sorrow and experiences of people, and to meet a grandmother who had 8 grandchildren staying in the house brought tears to my eyes. And now that I realize, okay, now I'm no longer just pastor of East Mount Zion, but I got to come here and meet a grandmother who is struggling to take care of not only 8 grandkids, but also her daughter who doesn't have enough money to take care of kids on her own, right? So I become one with them. And we have become so disconnected from them for so long because we've lived in our castles and our beautiful homes that it's become difficult to relate to, you know, your experiences and what you're going through. So one of the major pieces churches have to do is as a whole become one with community. The problem is that we have evangelism ministries and we have this ministry and we got that outreach ministry, and those outreach ministries goes out and do that work and they connect with them, but the whole church as a whole is not one with the sorrows and the conditions of people. And so you have entities that are one, but not the church that is one, because the church in itself is built by the black elite, or especially in the black church, especially your progressive black church. Now, there's some black churches that are made up of the common people, and they work and they do those ministries. And most of those churches are the smaller churches, but your larger churches are built up by those who have made it, right? And so, one of the difficult realities is that the whole church is not one with those who you're trying to become one with. And I ain't experiencing what you experience. I don't know what you're really going. I don't know what it means to not be able to pay my bills. I don't know what it means to grow up in the hood and hear gunshots and all that kind of stuff every day. I can try to sympathize with you, but I can't empathize with you. And so I stop at this kind of care. I can't give you total care. It's kind of like one of my favorite books is Enfleshing Freedom. It literally means to enflesh oneself with the actual sorrow, so then you can create freedom for the person. You can't give me nothing if you don't understand where I'm coming from. And I think that's what has happened to the church. And I think more churches need to encourage their church as a whole. One of the good things that we're doing here at East Mount Zion, and I'm encouraging our church as a whole to do community work, right? So not simply evangelism ministry, not simply this ministry. We don't know what 2021 gonna look like in terms of the first 6 months, so you don't know what your budget gonna look like. So what I told all of our ministry leaders is, well, you don't know what's gonna look like. Well, you do know you can get community. You do know you can create one event, right, in January or February. So people have to become one as a whole. And until that happens, there will continue to be a wider gap between those who have arrived and those who are still stuck in the mud.
And so looking at, and Pastor Cash, you're leading us into kind of wrapping up things for the evening. But looking at what is happening at East Mount Zion and thinking about the role of pastors, and as we close out, I want to end on, as a pastor, what are some of the ways that you have engaged in political awareness, advocacy, education, social involvement, social fighting against social injustices? What are some of the things that you are doing within your own church and within your own community?
One of the things that we've been doing here at Mount Olive over the last couple of years is we've been engaged with a predominantly white church, an Episcopalian church, in fact, to discuss race relations. In fact, that's what we've been calling our time together, Courageous Conversations on Race Relations. And it had grown, so we were up to about 85 people that were coming out once a month to our meetings. We'd first have dinner together at the church. Again, trying to form those relationships and to get to know one another. And it was an opportunity for our white brothers and sisters to kind of hear some of our stories as Black people, and they invited us in to do so. But what was born out of that was we were working towards action items that have kind of halted for a minute with the pandemic. But we have a social justice book club that was born out of that effort, where we continue to challenge racist ideas and racist notions, and try to uncover the blind spots that many people have when, oftentimes when white folks say, I'm not racist, it's a good chance that you are right away. You just because you're a nice person, that doesn't mean you don't have racist views. And so reading books like How to Become an Anti-Racist and Evicted, or the one right now, I'm Still Here, Black Dignity in a World Made for Whiteness, by Austin Channing Brown, I believe is her name. And so those have been very fruitful conversations, and a very different way to kind of do ministry as the Black church. But also some of us local pastors are trying to form together some kind of community amongst ourselves, because there's no ministerial alliance or anything like that here at this time. We recognize this need, as some of you all have touched on now, for us to be physically present out there with the people in response to the violence and some of the problems that are taking place in the community, because right now we're kind of missing in action here locally. And so as we try to form that coalition, we've done voting registration drives shared at all of our churches throughout the month of October. Again, we had the grill out, trying to find ways to engage the community. Come and get some food. It's for free. You don't have to pay anything. Oh, by the way, are you registered to vote? Have you completed the census? We have these laptops available, so on and so forth. Educating as well while advocating. And so these are just some of the things that we have been able to do with just a little bit of effort. We don't have it all the way perfected just yet. We're still trying to figure things out on the fly, but we sign people up, and we got people to be engaged, and people who are talking about they've never ever even voted before. And so that's just some of what we've been able to do so far.
Would anyone else like to share?
We've been, in my community, we've been working with other houses of worship through an interfaith. It's called the Montclair Interfaith Clergy Association, where the clergy come together. And so we've been working to try to enact policy. One of the ways that churches can be very helpful is to demystify the political process, and also help people say, sometimes we have these conversations about national politics, which are important. It's important who's in the White House. That's clear now, if it hasn't been before, to other people, but also what's happening in your local community. One of the things that's a big need in our community is affordable housing, right? And then stability. So we've been trying to enact rent control legislation, and that's been a challenge. So it's been some effort to try to educate people about what that means, about how we can do justice, and try to not just say, oh, we believe in affordable housing, we believe that this is a community that's welcoming to everybody, but how can we partner with our town council in order to get that done? One of the things that churches have, particularly pastors, is access. We have access to politicians many times because they know I don't want to come and meet with your church. And so we shouldn't just have them call us when they need us, but we should be unapologetic about calling them when we need them, and finding ways that we can partner when it's not just election season, but that how do we advocate for our communities, all the time.
One of the things that we do, in addition to what Reverend Howard and Reverend Fields talked about, is that for the last 25 years, we've been engaged in that aspect of the Civil Rights Act that dealt with Reverend Fields' fair housing. And so we have been affirmatively promoting fair housing for the last 25 years. Our church has 3.5 million square feet of dirt that we've been building affordable housing. We've stabilized the community to rebuild the community to single family. And one of the reasons that we did that is because, if I'm building affordable housing and housing, mixed income housing in the community, for me as a pastor, that translates to butts in the pews. So, a lot of times we talk about how do we get people to come back and how to, how can we still be that center? Well, sometimes we have to build the community around us and brighten the corner where we are and be engaged in, wasting time with people, as someone said, on various levels and fronts where people are. I mean, if we're going to be in the community ought to be better because the church is there, and not just an ecclesiastical museum where, it looks nice and we come there and we worship and we get out of there. But if we're going to be in the community needs to be better because we're there, whether it's housing, whether it's feeding, whether it's doing voter registration, whether it's, undergirding our schools, whether it's supporting those social movements that go on. So.
Thank
and I
you.
think it's important that we not be afraid to be perceived as political, not
Sure.
partisan, but political. Some churches are afraid. Like, I don't want to say too much about voting. I tell people when I'm preaching in my sermon, I won't tell you who to vote for. When I'm on my personal Facebook page, I will, right? I don't want to jeopardize the church's nonprofit status, but also we do not need to be afraid of being perceived as political, because there are other churches who have no problem with that and who have no problem promoting what they are advocating, even if it is not in the best interest or for the masses or aligned with what Jesus taught.
Mm-hmm. Pastor Cash, did you want to add anything else in regards to East Mount Zion before we close out?
Oh yeah, we just really reimagining what it means to share love to people, especially during this pandemic. So our ministry just have done a wonderful job in just going out and just sharing love in just some wonderful ways.
Thank you. I want to thank each and every one of you all for joining us tonight. This was such a great panel. I'm not surprised. I'm not shocked of the level of scholarship as well as biblical knowledge that each of you possess and the work that you are doing in your community. So I thank you. I thank you, Reverend Fields. I thank you, Reverend Howard, Reverend Punch, and Pastor Cash. I thank you for being a part of this discussion and allowing us to continue the discussion with talking about the role of the Black church. And so I'll leave you with this quote that came from a pastor that I interviewed a few years ago. Anything that is going on or anything that is going to affect the livelihood of your people, as a pastor, you have to educate. You don't have to be a politician, as Reverend Leslie stated, to discuss those things that are going to affect the daily lives. You talk about eating, you talk about work, clothes, food, and shelter. The things that affect people in your congregation are the things that are going to affect the church. You don't have to tell people what to vote for, but I think it's the responsibility of the pastor to make his or her congregation aware of what the political community is doing, as stated by a local pastor. So I thank you for joining us this evening on Courageous Conversations. If God has used this conversation to touch, change, or motivate one person, then our work is not in vain. God bless and good night.
Good night.
Good night. Thank you.
Good night. Thank you.